Yeah, thanks very much for doing this. It's really good to have you have you here, or on the computer with us. I've yeah, I've read most of your book, and followed you a bit. I listened to you on the Nori podcast months ago now. So it's really interesting views that you have about um, climate and geoengineering. And yeah, we've got a few questions that we're just going to go through with the community have been doing it on Slido. So hopefully Karen's going to be going through those with us. And I'll just read them out as we go through. But I've got a couple of questions to start with, just to get things going. But just to introduce you, actually, you're from the University of Buffalo, isn't it? And
Yeah, that's correct.
there we go. And did you used to work at the State Department? Is that right? At one point?
Just briefly, yeah, for about a year.
And now your thing is researching how society interacts with technologies that are well we're going to be using to address climate and biodiversity crisis. Is that right?
Mhm.
Um, okay. So just from one of the things you mentioned in your book is like about the differences between geoengineering and natural solutions, and just people um, how people kind of classify them a bit. Could you talk a bit more about that to kind of clarify what we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, geoengineering, also called climate engineering, sometimes climate intervention, is just a really broad umbrella term for basically two groups of technologies. One being carbon dioxide removal or methods to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and the other being solar radiation management or sunlight reflection methods. You'll hear a few different terms that refer to reflecting some fraction of incoming sunlight back out to space to cool the Earth. And these are kind of combined as geoengineering as a category. I think first and most prominently in a report by the UK's Royal Society in 2009 called Geoengineering Our Climate. You can still read that report as it's kind of the first authoritative or overview of all of these techniques. And nowadays, 10 years have passed. I think people are starting to talk about them separately more often. But carbon dioxide removal could be land-based carbon removals, like trying to store more carbon in soils or in forests, afforestation. It could be bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It could be machines that suck carbon directly from the atmosphere, in which case you still need to inject the CO2 underground. That's direct air capture. SRM methods, the most commonly modeled or talked about one is putting aerosols into the stratosphere, so into the upper layers of the atmosphere, which would reflect some sunlight. And you could do that with specially designed aircraft. Or another technique is marine cloud brightening, so making clouds at sea wider so that they reflect some sunlight. So those are kind of the main ideas talked about, but people may come up with more. Some may be rejected as scientifically not as feasible as they first seemed. I think for some of these techniques are pretty well established, like afforestation. Obviously, we know that planting trees sequesters carbon, but others are still in the very early stages of research.
Um, yeah, cool. Sorry, again, trying to follow lots of things. Um, One side of it of your book that you do a really good job of, and I think we're not very good at doing it in climate communication generally, is trying to imagine what different futures would be like. And you do these. First is these books that I used to, well, I never read them myself. My friends used to read at school, where you kind of choose your own story or choose your own storyline, and you do a bit of that. And also you talk about some really nice, interesting stories about what those different futures could be like. Um, do you have one of those which you particularly had a favourite of one of those? Which one was the one you particularly liked?
Yeah, well, my point with including some of the fiction was to just illustrate that the the challenges don't necessarily come from the technologies themselves. They come from the context in which these technologies are implemented. So you could have policies that continue extraction and exploitation, or you could have policies that use these technologies to support goals of social betterment and equity and so forth. So I was trying to kind of sketch out the range. And I guess the one that is sticking with me these days is a story about an older gentleman on a farm who has watched these direct air capture machines suck carbon from the atmosphere on his farm throughout his whole life. And now he's getting ready to retire, and they are also retiring these machines because they've filled up the underground caverns for the carbon dioxide storage. And I think about that because, there would be a moment when the project is completed, when the work is done, when, we put back the carbon that's above us and returned greenhouse gas concentrations to something like pre-industrial. I mean, that's something that's technically possible to do. It's not something that seems very likely or that, we currently have the political will to do. But I just wanted to highlight that, we can imagine a future where the world decides to do that and creates a safer climate for humans and for non-humans. So it's kind of definitely an optimistic story, but one I wanted to bring up because most of the time we talk about these technologies with a lot of dread and fear for good reasons.
Yeah, I'd agree. I find that when thinking about climate change, a lot of the time in the future, like I've kind of reconciled things being materially poorer in future, but I don't think that necessarily has to mean that we have a worse life. I think there's like a burden of choice that we have at the moment where there's just too much stuff that we have, and in future, like a simpler life or one that has less material goods or less consumption doesn't have to be a worse one. One of the things you also like really look at in your book is about the morality of whether we should use this or not use it. I know one of our questions is about the benefit of geoengineering outweighing the use of the current economic models to get these technologies off the ground. But it's like thinking about, I think that sounds like a bit like a moral hazard question. What do you feel about the ideas of you talk about social justice as well with regards to using this or not? Could you just elaborate a bit more on your thoughts on the using of it or not using it, and the circumstances under which it would be good to do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we have to talk about which specific approach. So maybe I'll talk about something like direct air capture or carbon capture and storage first. People are very concerned for good reasons about mitigation deterrence. So the idea that developing carbon capture at scale would be a way for fossil fuel companies to push off mitigation, or it'll be like a tactic of delay, which I think is a very real concern. I mean, it's kind of obvious. It's important to know that net zero contains a few different scenarios. So these net zero targets that we've had all around the world now in many countries imply not ceasing fossil fuels entirely. They imply some amount of residual emissions or leftover positive emissions from hard to mitigate sectors like cement or steel or agriculture or aviation. So some amount of continued emissions that's compensated by some amount of negative emissions. And so there's quite a big difference between there being, 500 million tons of continued emissions that get compensated, or 1 gigaton, 1 billion tons, versus 10 billion tons of continued emissions. For reference, current global emissions are between 40 and 50 gigatons of CO2. So you could have an imagination that we still have a quarter of current emissions, but we're just sucking all that back out. Or you could have imagination that we're actually very close to zero, and that part that's being compensated by the negative emissions is very small. And those are very, very different futures. One has a continuing fossil fuel industry and a mega scale direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage industry. One that has the infrastructure the size of the existing fossil fuel industry, basically, but for putting all that CO2 back underground. So that's one vision that's compatible with talking about a net zero target. But I think it's not what a lot of climate advocates are picturing when they're talking about net zero, right? They're thinking about this other scenario where actually we're very, very close to zero emissions, and there's just maybe a little bit of compensation for like greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, for example, are hard to think about how to eliminate from methane emissions from cows. I mean, there's going to be pastoralists in different countries that depend on cows for their livelihood. So that's like one way in which you can't get to complete zero, and you need some of this carbon removal capacity. But my point is that there's choices we can make about who gets to continue emitting that residual portion, and who bears the costs of removing the carbon. All of those are political questions that we need to be discussing. Even now, even though it seems to be in the future, these timelines, as you know, are very short.
Yeah, I often think about the World Climate Research Project report that came out in July, I think, this year, that says that we're more looking at 2.6 degrees to 3.9, and even with like massive carbon reductions, and it just makes me think. Do you think, and I know there's something in the Guardian at the moment, like Jonathan Bounder from Bristol University is one of the scientists who's kind of signed up to this idea of trying to be as honest as possible when communicating where we are, and it feels like we've got to know where we are to start off with before we can really start to chart a useful course to addressing the situation. Do you what do you think that there's utility in being completely honest with what the science says and stuff publicly about climate change with people, or do you think it's something that science society can't really take?
Oh no, I think that being honest is good, and then I think that range you just cited, 2.6 degrees of warming to 3.9, definitely coheres with what I've heard from the scientific community. And in terms of what that means, though, I mean, it's hard to translate those numbers into a lived future. And it takes some time to unpack all the implications on extreme weather, on sea level rise, on food production, et cetera. But yeah, honesty is the way to go, right?
I'd agree, and that's what we're trying to do here, really. One of the things that we try and do in the collective is to try and be as honest as possible about our prospects. So yeah, that's one of the reasons we sorted this out with you. So yeah, thanks for that. I listened to Toby Ord talking a while ago from Oxford University, thinking about prospects as well of getting through the next century. And I think he's like guessing roughly that society has about a 1 in 6 chance, with climate being one of the things that we face. And you said you used some kind of optimistic stories in your book. Are you personally optimistic with how we could use these technologies to basically chart a better course?
I mean, I think it's technically possible to employ a lot of these technologies. There's just not really a coalition of people advocating for it and demanding it, because it's hard if you've been, the problem with some of these industrial technologies for moving carbon at scale is the expertise and the capital to implement them lies with the fossil fuel industry. So who's been campaigning against the fossil fuel industry for many years is going to then go turn to them and say, oh, can you please, now just start removing carbon? Like, most people would rather just put those companies out of business and let them go bankrupt, right? Or at least most people I know. So it's a really challenging area, I think, because nobody wants to see them continue to profit after making this huge mess. On the other hand, I mean, if there's a way to publicly take ownership of companies, either by buying them out or other regulatory means, and then using that expertise and infrastructure to sequester carbon, like, I think we should be trying to do that. I think there's no reason not to, and there's everything to gain from it. I
One of
don't
the
know if
things,
that fully answers your question, but
I suppose it's just about that ongoing debate of whether we should or shouldn't use it, and the idea of the moral hazard in that if we do use it, then we're just going to use that time to just twiddle our thumbs or just carry on with business as usual. Do you think that's a justification for not using geoengineering?
well, here I think we have to separate out carbon removal, which is mostly what I've been talking about, from solar geoengineering, because they're very, very, very different technologies. So I think that there's with solar geoengineering or sunlight reflection or whichever phrase you want to use for reflecting light back into space with aerosols in the stratosphere, I think that there's that very clear danger that that becomes the kind of crisis response that's originally pitched as a crisis response or time buying response and then gets stretched out into being the response because we don't develop the capacity to actually decarbonize because the immediate pressure is off. I see that as a very deep risk. And so, it's one of the many reasons I'm hoping that we don't choose to use those technologies, or governments or the powers that be don't choose to use those technologies. And that's actually part of why I'm an advocate of developing carbon removal at scale, is because that seems like just such a better path.
One of the things I think about the use of macroalgae, I tried to do a talk on this about a year ago, and I read some of the papers that you'd looked at in your book on it. And to me, it seems like I read that the Dutch have looked into it, and they continue to do so. But one of the biggest barriers is that international agreement to really scale up by using international waters. And I know one of the processes that you describe in a couple of articles you've written in the book looks like it would be in the open ocean. Do you know of anything in terms of us really starting to bridge those gaps about having international agreements in farming the oceans?
Well, you're talking about like iron fertilization, like putting substances into the ocean that would produce a plankton bloom,
I was
correct?
thinking of the ones where you have the macroalgae, like on massive platforms that have kind of
Oh,
ballast on
oh
them that
yes,
go up and
like
down.
seaweed farming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that. So the thing about seaweed ranching or farming or whatever at scale um, is that once you grow the seaweed, if the seaweed just like dies, then that carbon returns, right? So you have to do something with it. Either you harvest it and you can turn it into biofuels, and then you separate out the CO2 and store it. Or there's been discussion about just kind of figuring out ways to sink that biomass to the bottom of the ocean where it would stay. But I feel like this concept needs to be developed better. And people are researching it. I think that's really good. I think that technique has less legal issues from an international law standpoint because it involves it's basically kind of like an aquaculture operation, like, and this isn't, I'm not a legal scholar, but my understanding is that it wouldn't be that different than farming fish out at sea. That some of the issues are, if you're really doing it at this huge scale, then you might have you have to navigate where ships can go and all that kind of thing. But we're pretty far from that at the current level of development. I mean, seaweed farming is something that's done, all over the world, especially in Asia. So it's not a totally novel thing. The novel part would be figuring out how to use it for carbon removal.
One of the things I kind of fantasize about with it as well is I thought about the use of that and reading the Nyert paper. Is it Nyert paper who discusses it and talks about getting us back to 280 ppm by 2070, and thinking about that's all about biofuels, but also you talked about biochar in your book, and I've heard the chap that you interviewed about that talk on it as well, and it seems like if we could join up the two technologies, then there's a huge amount of impacts we could have in terms of using biochar as the actual carbon store, because obviously it yields some sort of benefits as well.
Yeah.
But it seems weird that it's not being used or it's not being talked about very much, because everyone's talking about the instability of geologically storing carbon dioxide. And it's like, can you not just make it into a solid form, which is going to be stable for thousands of years, and put it into buildings, put it into roads, put it into soils, and then even if we don't need to put it, if we run out of like construction methods or soils to remediate, we can just pile it up and do it like landfill and build buildings on it. And does it not seem? It seems a bit odd to me that biochar hasn't really been looked at yet. And the government report or the carbon brief did a report on it a while ago, just basically saying that it didn't really look like it was viable yet. And yet it seems like something that people could do in their back garden, right up to massive industries. And you can obviously char the seaweed to do that.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it merits more research and attention than it gets. I think people are drawn to some of these more industrial techniques in part because they're thinking about, with biomass, it implies land except for the seaweed, which you were mentioning. And it also implies an opportunity cost. So what else could that land or that, piece of ocean, I guess, be used for? And so people look at some of those limitations and then they think about what else you could be doing with the biomass or the land. And then they start thinking about geologic storage for those reasons. But I agree that sometimes these technologies receive less attention because they don't have the same networks of actors advocating for them. Not to put down the biochar community, because I do think there's actually a very active community around biochar, but they just might not be in the right rooms at the right times.
Are you seeing much of an increase in the amount of investment in research for carbon capture and geoengineering projects?
Not around solar geoengineering at all, but definitely around carbon removal, because now that we have all these net zero targets, policymakers and others are starting to think about, okay, how do we actually achieve them? And they're looking at the numbers and the roadmaps and they're thinking, oh my God, my roadmap still has like 10, 20% residual emissions. What's going to scale to compensate for that? And so I definitely think there's been an uptick of interest, and that's going to be followed by some level of research funding. But whether it's commensurate with the scale of the challenge, probably not. I don't know.
Do you think with solar radiation management, using sulfate aerosols, is one of the questions Tia's asked is about whether it would make kind of an unlivable planet for us? Do you know anything more about the sulfate aerosol side of things?
I mean, I think that's, people identify that as a risk. I think that I agree with the scientists that say that, we can mitigate that risk because it's not something that happens overnight, right? The solar geoengineering is an intervention that would take decades, if not centuries. And so if you begin that and you're monitoring the results and within a few years it doesn't look like what the models had predict, you can ramp it down again without too much damage. It's just like the time horizons of the response there. The way you would get to an unlivable planet with that approach is if you had been doing it for 100, 200 years and then suddenly stopped. I mean, and in that instance, there would be a termination effect where the warming that had been suppressed comes back. So that scenario supposes first that you haven't done anything to decarbonize and bring carbon emissions down and start carbon removal during those centuries. And it supposes that there's some interruption to this program, some reason why it can't be maintained by the people in the world. And if that situation arises, chances are it's because there's been a war or some other calamity that's going to be really bad, independent of the solar geoengineering. I mean, that's going to be a dark scenario on its own. So I'm not dismissing that possibility, but I'm explaining why people some people don't see it as a very likely scenario.
I think that's one of the things to be really mindful of, isn't it? Is that we have the climate challenge on our hands now, the climate and biodiversity crisis right now, and governments weren't really thinking about pandemic, and obviously talk about conflict and any other number of things that could happen that we aren't really considering at the moment, like Carrington events or something like that. You know, we're not really putting much energy into thinking about the confluence of many of these things happening at once. So it's like a bit like natural variation not really being charted very well in pathways to net zero or our likelihood of impacts on societies, because we're not thinking about what the step change will be in global warming with regards to a really outlandish a really outlandish divergence from the norm and stuff in terms of climate events. Kickstarting things a bit faster than we thought they would. I've got another question from Lawrence Bowling here. It says, if direct air capture is our future, the likelihood of it being timely seems low. Would it be better to keep it as a potential added bonus and focus effort towards real zero?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard many people suggest that, including the climate journalist David Roberts recently made that argument that, this would be a later in the century thing after we've gotten to zero, then use direct air capture to mop up for their legacy emissions. I think there's merit to that approach. I just think that you'd want to begin the R&D now, because it could take a while to figure out how to bring the cost down. And these are big infrastructures that take a very long time to build. So I think that even if we want it later in the century, we should be investing in research and development and starting to deploy it now and figuring out what works, because it's just like the time scales of that infrastructure are massive. But I can understand why people don't want to focus on it too much right now. And I'm in favor of separate targets for emissions reduction and carbon removal. I think that those should be viewed as different categories.
Yes, I've forgotten about that until you just mentioned it, actually. That seems like a very, very important thing to do that gets lost in the narrative that we have at the moment. Do you think there's a reason why we do just focus on net zero? And despite the fact that we're going to be using loads of the technologies that are going to get us to net zero to go net negative, we still just talk about net zero like the journey's going to end in 2050 and everything will be fine. Do you think it would be better to talk about, as you try and imagine a different future where we are continuing to try and get our planet back to a state that it's been so useful to us, or it's the healthiest state that it could be in?
I mean, for me, the problem with net zero, or at least one of the problems, is that it still focuses on emissions. And when the discussion is about emissions, then you're not focusing on production. So I think we should be focusing on the managed decline of fossil fuels, or phase out, or exit, or whichever of those words you want to choose, that focuses on how do we stop producing the stuff. And focusing on emissions conveniently allows that to be not as prominent in the conversation.
How do you think? I know you wrote a part in your book about regenerative farming or regenerative agriculture. How big a part do you think that is going to play, or should play, in our efforts to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis?
I'm not sure it's going to be that big of a solution with regards to climate change. I think that some of the main reasons for doing it involve the broader ecological crisis and the food system sustainability. And I think those are very valid reasons. And I don't think everything has to be about carbon. I think that for many people in the world, reforming how food is grown for the sake of food security and ecological co-benefits or whatever is going to be way more important than tracking the carbon. So that's my view. I think it's really important and deserves investment on its own, separate from carbon stuff.
And what do you think is the worst geoengineering idea that you've heard of?
I mean, I've heard of a lot, and some of them are worse in the sense that they're just very fringe and would never work. But I guess the worst ones are the ones that actually have potential for uptake. And so, I don't know. That's a great question. That's a very hard question. And sometimes an idea might not be the worst scientifically, but it might be the worst in the way people are like talking about it or describing it. So I have a particular annoyance with ocean iron fertilization in that regard, just because, I mean, maybe it could work, but some of the claims made about it, that it's going to be this huge industry or whatever, and really profitable. I think that's the worst for me when techniques are framed as being like business opportunities. Any technology could be the worst if it's just sold as some like miracle cure snake oil type thing.
That's interesting. A lot of them do talk along those lines, don't they? And also the talking up of the effectiveness about it. We do like with the macroalgal, ocean afforestation, those kinds of ideas, talking about it in a sense that it could be the one. And the Crowther Institute and their paper about trees, it took a bit of a kick in the whatevers when they said, basically this could pretty much address our emissions. And then lots of criticism came out about it, saying a lot of the land you're talking about is not going to be available for tree planting, or you couldn't plant those trees there. It's like that seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it, in the claims made by these kinds of ideas. One of the things, in terms of the good and bad ideas, I've heard Kevin Anderson talk about direct air capture and doing it with, obviously concrete and steel, aluminium, and all the other materials that are needed. I remember hearing him talk about it and just saying, us just doing that on a scale that we needed to do it to offset our emissions and start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere would tip us over just in the amount of materials and emissions we would need to use or produce to employ roll those technologies out. Do you think that's one of those areas where we're not really thinking about the whole picture, and also where those materials have to be drawn from other parts of society so that we couldn't use them?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about the material use. And you could say the same thing for renewables to some extent, but direct air capture presumes also this huge build out of renewables, plus all the materials for the direct air capture, and the sorbents or the chemicals used can actually be very intensive to produce. Julia Rialmonte and others have published some scientific papers with calculations of this. I think it's very daunting, and I don't have like a great answer for like how we're going to do it. I'm also not like a material flow analyst, but I definitely think that it requires a lot more attention, both in terms for direct air capture and even just for solar and wind, where we started to see more analysis along those lines in terms of raw materials and attention to where in the world they're produced and under what conditions, which I think is hopeful that we can apply that knowledge to thinking about scaling up direct air capture too. And incidentally, this is another reason why I'm in favor of building new nuclear, even though I don't think it's a great solution.
Yes, that's another contentious one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel quite pro-nuclear personally, just because, the land footprint is really small, the amount of waste is really small. I think it's largely misunderstood. But again, as you say, we're going to need a lot more energy, it seems, if direct air capture is going to be a player, and not a lot less. But again, it seems to be, it's like this, I think they describe it as a hyper object, trying to address climate change and it being just too big for us to really have a working knowledge of as a single person. So everyone's ideas have these blind spots that don't really provide a whole solution to the issues. But what are your reservations about nuclear?
I mean, the same as anybody's in terms of figuring out secure long-term storage, and the legacy of mining uranium in the Navajo Nation, or these kinds of environmental justice concerns that have plagued the industry that hasn't quite been reckoned with fully. But I do think that, climate crisis is a crisis, and I think that I don't want people to be in energy poverty, so I think that the whole transition will work better with some further nuclear capacity, even though it's not a perfect solution.
You mentioned David Roberts earlier, and he did a really interesting article in Vox a couple of weeks ago about shifting baselines. Do you think there's a danger that we'll just get the 1% or the richer countries will just get used to things getting slowly worse, and so we may not actually address climate in a timescale that's useful, because we've got this lead-in time that makes it kind of uncanny, or makes it very difficult for us to be able to address it effectively, because it's the effects are basically 30 years down the road or more. Do you think shifting baselines could undermine our efforts?
I think there's plenty of things that could undermine our efforts. I'm concerned about the response to the coronavirus undermining our efforts. I'm probably at this point more concerned about the effect of social media on society than I am about climate change, actually, because it's something that could erode our ability to respond if, democratic institutions are eroded and people can't have a conversation about a topic, right? So I don't know. Shifting baselines is one of many things that could decrease response capacity.
Do you think that there's an economic model that would help us do this better in terms of using carbon drawdown to get us out of this and addressing the climate crisis? The example given here by Heather is like donut economics type models.
Yeah, I don't know if I have one particular favorite model or theory, but I definitely think we need, industrial planning and policy to confront this crisis, and some level of a planned economy. And I think that we have the information technology to execute that on a level that, previous examples of planned economies could have never anticipated, really. So there's a lot of people looking at all the money that's been spent on coronavirus stimulus and recovery and saying, couldn't we spend an equivalent amount on climate change and scaling up renewables and all the other types of, aspects of the energy transition? And it seems pretty doable given the sums of money we're looking at.
What have you seen in the last few years that makes you feel most positive regarding our chances of dealing with climate change? That one's from Owen Standen.
We've seen remarkable rollbacks or phase outs of coal. A lot of that was because of the shale revolution and cheap natural gas, but still some of it has been a changing narrative and pressure from investors. So I feel like there's some signals. I'm not going to be completely confident that we're headed for a phase out of oil and gas, but we're talking about peak demand for oil and even gas now, and that wasn't the case just a few years ago. So I'm feeling positive about that. I'm feeling positive about renewed attention to structural racism and environmental justice at a level that we didn't have just a few years ago. I guess those are the main things I'm feeling hopeful about.
It does seem that there's an incredible level of ambition growing in almost across all sectors as well, doesn't it? And if you look, you can see the beginnings of it. And it feels like there's a danger of looking at the progress we're making now. Obviously, it's nowhere near enough what we need, but at the same time, it's like if you're like a watch pot never boils kind of idea. If you're watching it really, really closely, then you can quite easily get disillusioned with the lack of progress we're making. But as you say, if you step back and start to look at the level of progress we're making overall, and just think of this as the beginning, then it could be that this could be like an exponential growth in all the right sectors. Obviously, there'll be some dead ends and problems that we cause ourselves along the way. But it does seem that there are many, like even across the oil and gas sector with BP doing their thing, it seems like there's a lot of stories to be told about things starting to get better across the board. what would be, if you were talking to someone who was really against the idea of geoengineering, or someone on the left, as it were, what would be your kind of justification for using it?
Well, I'm not sure that we need to use all of it. I don't think we need to use solar geoengineering at this point, but my case for engaging with it as a thing you engage with in whichever way is that it seems likely that discussions of it aren't going to go away. So you want to be informed and you want to have a voice in shaping it, because there's different choices to be made. You know, we could prevent a worst case scenario if we engage. And when it comes to carbon removal, I think there's a huge case for engaging in how it's done, because there's questions about who should be doing it, who should be paying for it, how much we need. All of those things I think that civil society should be deciding, and the default is going to be that a bunch of corporations decide on all of those fronts. So unless we weigh in, and if we just say, oh, we reject all of this, you know, we're losing the chance to make those decisions, and that would be a shame.
Sorry, looking through the questions again. Oh yeah, what do you? We get this question comes up a lot now. What do you think we've learned from COVID-19 that we can take forward to tackle the climate crisis? From Maya.
I think one thing we've learned is that when you're responding to a crisis, you want a whole bunch of different types of people in the room informing the response. And you want to be able to anticipate follow-on effects from those responses. So, you know, when governments have been making policies, they've been thinking, I mean, in one way, expectedly so, about things like, you know, stopping the transmission of a pathogen. But now we're in a case where, you know, millions of people in the developing world, millions of young women are being sold basically into child marriage, and, you know, millions of children are at risk of malnutrition because there's these chains of follow-on effects from policies we adopt in the global north that have real implications for people. And we're not thinking through all of those chains. We're not thinking about, you know, the rise in authoritarianism as a consequence of a response to a pandemic, right? Those things aren't necessarily connected, or we don't even have documentation, frankly, about how some decisions were made. So I think there's a case for a much more transparent, broad, inclusive way of informing response to a crisis. And I think that's very relevant for climate change, because I would hate to see something like solar geoengineering being proposed in a climate emergency if the only people at the table were like engineers or modelers. I don't think that would go very well. So I think that's one lesson. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of how we communicate science and talk about our goals for interventions, talk about the timescales of interventions. You know, if you read the Imperial College report from March about the one that kind of kicked off policymaker awareness about COVID, it's very clear that there's a set of interventions that are going to need to be maintained and switched on and off for 18 months. I don't think the public in March was really briefed on an 18-month duration experience, you know, and I think that we could have better compliance with public health measures if people had thought about the time frame of that intervention in a different way. So, I mean, there's a ton to learn here about communication and transparency and engagement and all this stuff. It sounds like very high level words, but we have now sadly really concrete examples.
We've had that problem with the use of masks in COVID, and, you know, people being told that actually don't worry about it, and it's now broadly seen as a method of trying to make sure that there wasn't like a massive run on them so the government couldn't get hold of them when they needed to. And so, there's that area where, we weren't presented with as much information as we should have been, and we weren't trusted with it. I suppose that's the other side of things with climate. It's really, really like, you quite often get people, and we have people in the collective who feel this way sometimes, just like there's nothing that we can do to get out of this. And the more sometimes it's not comforting at all. So in that instance with COVID, it would be masks are really good, but I can't use one because I've got to let the government have them all. But with climate as well, it's like climate's really bad, but what can I do about it? There's this idea that if you're too honest with people, then they just end up just not making any decisions and just carrying on as normal. Do you think that's something that's an issue as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a huge mistake with COVID. I think that it would have been a lot better to just say, we think masks might help. We're building an evidence base for it. This is our best guess. We think you should use it, right? Instead of it treating the public like they can't think through. I don't know what to say here. Well, I would say generally that I think that people should approach the public with more sophistication and confidence. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because we've had all these examples of bad behavior that kind of become caricatured, but I do think actually most people want to do the right thing or the best thing they can. Maybe it sounds naive, but I don't know. I've talked to a lot of different types of people and I've actually found that. So once you get out of your bubble and you actually go talk to people you might think will be different than you, they might not actually be that different.
What do you think, given that, thinking about people possibly being more responsible and resilient than we're often given credit for, what do you think governments should do well, I suppose really it's going to come down to what kind of guest do they think where do they think we're going to be in 50 years? Where do you, if you were in the government, what would you be telling the public about climate if you had like a really clear message in terms of what to do about it?
What to do about it? Well, I don't think there's that much that individuals can do because the solutions are really structural. So, what I'd be telling the public is like the things that I'm going to do as the government, right? I'd be like, I'm going to invest a bunch in clean energy and I'm going to do procurement, and every, vehicle that the government buys is going to be electric, and I'm going to figure out, an infrastructure for charging, and I'm going to build up public transit even more. And because I know electric vehicles aren't affordable for everybody, and just, sector by sector, the whole list. I mean, that's why we have a bunch of ministries, right? Because they all work on different parts of it. So,
So do you really feel that it's the top-down approach is the answer to this?
Yeah, but you don't get there unless you have people voting for that top-down approach. So that's the other side of it. Like people, they might not be able to do that much in their individual choices because they're choosing from a really limited set of options. So they don't have the choice to take a bus because there isn't one, or they don't have an electric vehicle because it's not affordable. So the government needs to make those choices available, and then people can choose them. Right now, what people can do is they can vote and they can advocate. So I'm glad people are doing that, but it's kind of on the government to listen.
You think we could start seeing climate being the main issue in elections in the coming years?
I think in the US, it's going to be one of three, but probably still beyond the economy and healthcare, just because we have so many problems with healthcare. But like in a country that has good healthcare, like Sweden, probably climate can become number one. Yeah.
One of the questions again from Heather is talking about: do you see much thinking about the ecological impact of these different solutions? People are really worried about obviously the one using algae in the oceans and stuff. It seems like the open ocean is basically a desert with lots of water in it, nothing much else. Do you see much assessment of the ecological impact on those kinds of ecosystems or any of these programs that people discuss?
Definitely not enough. And I think part of the reason, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that maybe ecologists are less likely to want to spend their time researching some of these ideas because they might seem intuitively like not like a good idea, like very, very, you know, very complex. But I think another reason is that some of these ideas, you can get a publication out on them by running a model, and the types of the ways you might need to study ecology would be a lot more expensive than running a computer model that is already developed and already exists. Like you might need complicated field trials. They might take a long time to do and a lot of resources to execute, or you might need different types of models that are used in ecology that aren't already coupled to some of these other models. I think that it's a more challenging research problem, maybe, which is why without significant funding, we're not going to see the level of research we need there.
Another question that's a really good one, actually, with regards to the natural solutions in terms of capturing carbon, we've got this kind of moving target of a lot of those ecosystems that we would rely upon degrading through the impacts that we're already seeing. Do you have any thoughts about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy that, we have a lot of research and hope on blue carbon, but coastal ecosystems and wetlands are still being degraded and decimated at a terrible rate. So, I mean, in one way, carbon might be this shiny new object, but we just need to go for protecting wetlands in the first place. And then there's, I mean, the thing about, who wants to bet on a forest being this carbon sink 40 years in the future when the chances of it being hit by a wildfire are increasing? Like many of these solutions are vulnerable both to human actions, so they need very long-term policies, but they're also vulnerable to climate change itself. And that's part of why I'm an advocate for industrial carbon removal as well. I mean, yeah. I think we need both, but
I mean, there are some truly astonishing ideas out there. And again, if you talk about the use of nuclear, then, we could basically be in a position where we've got limitless energy almost. And in terms of ecosystems being degraded or us modifying ecosystems, as soon as you start desalinizing things and making water available to ecosystems, even in very hot environments, you can have a golf course in the middle of the desert in the Middle East, and it can still be there as long as you just keep pumping loads of water all over it. And it's got like a 6-inch thick fairway. It seems like that we could offset some of those impacts. And there's even talk of just putting just remediating the salinity of coastal habitats and stuff to make sure that you can grow the biodiversity there that you need, and make it a kind of haven for biodiversity even when you have increasing acidity. Do you have have you had a recommendation of what could be done by government bodies? Because we're part of largely in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I'm at the Environment Agency. Do you have any recommendations that government bodies could have in terms of trying to deliver the most positive effects from natural climate solutions?
I mean, I don't have any kind of high level things, but there's a lot of good work done on this because a lot of the big NGOs who have in-house research capacity have produced a lot of, best practices and reports and policy suggestions. So you could look at the work that IUCN and the Nature Conservancy have done. There's kind of a group out of Oxford that they've put together, standards for nature-based solutions that would be like, if you go about it, here's the standards we should have for society and biodiversity and all these things. So I would really look to to those guidelines and others, and then I could send on references. I mean, there's been a lot of good work done on this in the past few years.
Do you think, in terms of people reducing their footprint, that's obviously one thing that people can do. Do you also think, Nick Walker's got a question here, do you think people should start painting their roofs white? So we could start, getting involved in geoengineering to an extent, as well as reducing our footprint. We could lower the temperature of our houses.
I wonder, I mean, there would be a trade-off between having the roof white or having solar panels on it or having a green roof, and I wouldn't know how to evaluate that trade-off for any given house, because it probably depends a lot on like the angle of your roof and where exactly that roof is and stuff like that. So I think probably for some places it could be good. I mean, I think that this where it really makes a difference in this like urban heat island effect. If you have like a large commercial property that did that, it could make a difference locally in the climate, I think.
Yeah, I do think about these kinds of things. I mean, one of the things that we did was really stupid. I think we got new double glazing, which was great, but there's a real fashion in the United Kingdom for having kind of gunmetal grey windows, and in the summer they're like radiators. So you have your windows shut, but of course you've got the frames that are just roasting hot, and they're just conducting heat indoors all the time. So yeah, I think we'll be painting those white, and we've got gunmetal grey windowsills, and you see houses all over being built new with the same colour roofing tiles matching their window frames, and it just seems like, yeah, start low, the form over function kind of situation comes up a lot. I know we're coming near to the end of this, but how do you think, you came up with lots of visions about the future and possible scenarios. When you think about the future, I know lots of people thinking about these issues really worry about it, and there's all this uncertainty. What do you think about our prospects, and what do you think any of the stories that you've told in your book are ones that are likely to come true?
A lot of the stories I was telling were more about the kind of human relationships between different characters that you might have. And so those are always kind of classic, I guess. I think that, most likely we'll be muddling through towards 3 degrees, but you never know what'll happen. I remember doing a scenario exercise with a bunch of experts in 2015, and my scenario was that Trump became president, and nobody said that was like a viable thing that could happen, and it happened. So you can prepare to be surprised for the worst, but I'm also surprised about all the coal phase outs in rapid time, and a broad climate movement that exceeded my expectations of just a few years ago. So I think that there are social tipping points that you can't anticipate. For me, the most interesting thing is how all these technologies are going to grow up together. So not just ecological restoration or climate intervention technologies, but artificial intelligence and biotechnologies. I think they could all inform each other in interesting and surprising ways.
So I'm just trying to read through the questions again quickly. Okay. Yeah, I think about it as well in the respect that we don't know, and it's going to be a muddle, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. Yeah, there are certainly so many solutions out there, and as you say, there are these social tipping points that we could already be witnessing, and I think that's a really important thing to focus on, and just try and fan the flames of what's already happening. I know some people personally who are really really worried, almost crippled by thinking about what the future looks like. And for me, I just think about it, us not really needing as much as we have, or as much as we think we have, and just how people can be much happier with, even if I heard Nate Hagen's being interviewed as another academic from your side of the pond, talking about, even if you wipe 25% of the national of GDP, global GDP, we'd be taken back to 1990 levels, and that's obviously when I grew up, and that was all right. I was pretty happy, and even 50% would be 1970s, but then we would still have all the infrastructure that we currently have. You know, we would try to repair more of it, and that's something that's not really that attractive for people wanting to build things. They just want to build new and put their stamp on it, and having a repaired job of something that someone else has created isn't so glamorous. But you know, there's a huge amount of infrastructure and resource that we already have available to us that we're not really, I don't think we've really started to capitalize on yet. Um, but so broadly, would you say that you're kind of optimistic about the future then? Cautiously optimistic?
I wouldn't say I am, but I'm not super pessimistic either, which is actually an achievement given like how much information I've consumed about all these topics.
That's good to hear. It was interesting actually listening to Toby Ord being interviewed as well. He talked about how even in the community that he's in, thinking about our chances, he was saying obviously it's quite a depressing thought thinking about the end of humanity and all these different scenarios and the likelihood of us surviving or society surviving. But again, he said it was often people find themselves just focusing on the outcomes that do work and the scenarios where we do make it. And he said that it was a discipline filled with optimists. Apparently, maybe that helps offset the difficulties that they would have to deal with in thinking about it all. Well, thanks very much for spending a bit of time listening to our questions and giving us some insight into what you've understood about this expansive issue of climate and natural solutions and carbon removal and geoengineering. Thanks to everyone who's dialed in, not dialed in, just watching us. So that's it. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you all for being engaged with climate.
Yeah. All right, Holly. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.